So we've had a little while now with no one in the waiting room, so I think we'll get going, and I can always admit people as we go. So as Lonnie said, my name is Amy and I am the curator of Egham Museum. Welcome everyone to our first live audio described online event. It's the first one like this, so we're really grateful to have Lonnie with us. Today we will be describing the Egham Visions Land in the Bend of the River exhibition, which is our current exhibition, which is thanks to a artist in residence program we had last year with the lovely Estella Castle, who joins us today. And this exhibition was all about bringing together Estella's artistic practices with the work of the museum. So today we have myself, Amy Stone, Egham Museum curator. Estella Castle is with me on screen, and she is the artist in residence from last year. And we also have Lonnie Evans from Vocalize, who is going to be doing the audio description for us. So I'm going to pass over to Lonnie and she's going to start. We're going to all describe ourselves for everyone in the room, and then we'll get started.
Hi everyone, thanks Amy. My name is Lonnie Evans and I'm going to be your Vocalize audio describer for this event this afternoon, providing visual interpretation for our blind and partially sighted attendees. So I thought we'd start by describing ourselves, just to say that I am a white middle-aged woman. I've got quite a lot of freckles. I have long auburn hair cut with a heavy fringe, and I'm broadcasting from my studio here in Brighton. So I've got a white background behind me and two quite abstract pieces of artwork behind me, which I hope it won't be too distracting. I've got one features waves and rocks and the others triangles and circles. And I've got a colourful dress on and black velvet jacket with patches. I'm going to ask Amy and Estella to describe themselves in a moment, but just to say that this afternoon's event will last about an hour. We've selected 7 key objects to tell the story of the exhibition. They will be accompanied by photographs which will appear on screen for those who might find them useful, but I will also be offering live audio description of each of our objects as we encounter them. Just to let you know that the chat function has been turned off, as it can be distracting for those using screen readers, but we will enable the chat 10 minutes before the end so that we can have a question and answer session with Estella and Amy. This is a webinar, so only the panelists will be on screen during the talk, and the event is being recorded. So just to let you know. I'm going to pass over now to Amy to describe herself, and then Estella, but those guys are both sitting in the same space, so you picture them sitting side by side.
Thanks, Lonnie. Yeah, so we are both in the museum research room. So behind us, you can see a large number of brown archive boxes on our shelves. Very authentic experience for you this evening. Yes, so I am Amy. I am a white woman in my late 20s. I've got longish dark brown hair, quite pale, some freckles as well, joining Lonnie in the freckle club, and I wear glasses, and today I'm wearing a nice cozy warm grey jumper. Over to Estella.
Hi, I'm Estella Castle. I'm also a white woman in my late 30s, long dark brown hair, and also lots of freckles, and wearing a big cozy jacket because it's cold in the museum.
Thanks, guys. So I'm going to ask Amy and Estella to set up the themes of the show at the moment, but I just wanted to describe the space where this exhibition is happening. I know we're not in the space, but we can enter it imaginatively. So the exhibition, Land in the Bend of the River, takes place at Egham Museum in a large white painted gallery. The rectangular room is approximately 11 meters long and 5 wide. It has a grey carpet, windows at one end, and is brightly lit by strip lights and spotlights overhead. As we enter the space, the thing that strikes us first are Estella's artworks, 2 large sculptures featuring heritage wheat straw as their main material. And naturally, I'm going to describe those in much more detail in a moment. But as we enter the space, there's a rich scent of straw, evocative of entering a stable yard or a barn. Also on display and taking up most of the wall space are 14 pairs of small John Hassell watercolors. They're, as I said, small detailed works, all presented in matching white frames, painted in the early 1800s. They feature local country residences and are displayed alongside historical information on that period. And at the far end of the room, there's a small cabinet displaying some artifacts from the museum collection, which we'll explore in more detail in a moment. There's also a painting by Estella of an early enclosure map from the late 19th century on the wall. And we're just going to get an image of that on screen at the moment. It features an aerial image of Egham when it was all countryside. It's very urban now, but we're going to be talking about when it was all countryside. And this image is of golden and orange fields surrounding a bend in the River Thames. The painting's on a white wall. It shows the River Thames, which is labelled inside yellow borders as it snakes along the top of the painting with an angular bend in direction in its upper reaches. And fanning out underneath the waterway, a dense patchwork of golden, bronze and yellow fields viewed from above, some texted to indicate different crops. Now, printed text at the start of the exhibition asks us to imagine that it's an early 1800s and we're standing in the fallow field, surveying the surrounding farmland of Egham. There are heavy horses pulling a plough. The men and some women of the community are working in these fields. And this way of life, the open field system, is swiftly coming to an end with the introduction of enclosure. And away in the distance, we're asked to imagine there's a large country house. Now, these large local properties feature in John Hassell watercolor paintings and prints, and one of which, Portnell Park, is on our screen now and is our first key object and our jumping off point for the imaginative journey that we're going to go on with the Stella. This John Hassell watercolor was painted in 1824. It's just 20 centimeters long and 15 high and painted in subtle tones. The central image of a grand house set in lush grounds overlooking a lake is surrounded by a white border. In the border above the painting, the artist has written in neat cursive script in black ink, simply Egham. And in the border below, the title of the work and the name of the then owner of the property. This house is known as the Dormie House, and it's entitled Portnell Park, Reverend Thomas Biss. Lower right corner, but interestingly, he hasn't left himself quite enough room to fit the date in, and he's written 1824 with the 4 slightly below the rest of the numbers. We'll talk to Amy a little more about John Hassell in a moment, but just to say he was an English watercolor landscape painter, engraver and illustrator. And this piece is typical of his work, which concentrates on architecture of interest generally in rural settings. The Dormie House was built in the late 18th century on the Portnell Park estate, which passed through several owners, and in 1795 was bought by the Reverend Biss, who remodelled part of the property. Hassell's painting depicts the house from afar, situated on top of a gentle hill on the left, overlooking the shores of Virginia Water, a man-made lake on the right of the image. The artist's perspective is situated on the grassy shore by the lake, which fills the right half of the foreground. The lake has a curvaceous edge and its rippled surface is rendered in bold grey and silver brushstrokes. At the foot of the hill, there's a long pale path that runs by the water, stretching off into the distance, where there's a small copse of grey-green trees, which continue behind the property. There are trees of different kinds, some rounded, some tall, their foliage rendered by swathes of colour with black detailing on top. And one lone tree, which resembles a small oak, stands alone by the water's edge. The house is painted a pale colour. It has a brown sloping tiled roof with 2 tall brick chimneys. The building has 2 sections, a taller 4-storey part at the rear with a rounded tower-like end gable which faces the lake. And this abuts a smaller 3-storey building at the front with a grey stone entrance porch surrounded by shrubs. The windows of the property are larger on the 2nd and 3rd floors, and all the windows have been painted a pale blue by the artist. The upper section of the image, about half of the total space, is filled with sky. Hassell paints this big sky in a delicate wash of eggshell blue, with central swathes of puffy white cloud looming up from behind the house. The image is peaceful, orderly, and serene, and like Hassell's other works, devoid of human inhabitants completely, concentrating purely on the landscape. Amy, can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, so John Hassell is very well known for his works like this. We have many in our collection, and while they're all of different houses, your words kind of peaceful and serene, Lonnie, are very accurate in describing actually most of the works of John Hassell. And he was extremely popular because of the way that he uses artistic license to create this image of mostly houses, and as you say, mostly devoid of any people. The way that they came into the museum collection is quite interesting, because the museum was founded in 1968 in order to sort of preserve the history of the local area. And throughout the kind of 70s and 80s, the team went out and sought funding to enable them to continue that. And when these artworks came up for sale at auction, it was decided that we had to have them. They were such a great record of Egham in the 1820s, and it was really important to the team that we were able to keep them. So we didn't have the money at the time, we didn't have the funds available to buy them. So fundraising was done. We wrote to all of the people who may or may not be able to fund such a purchase. And luckily, with some money from very generous donors, including Art UK, the Art Fund, we were able to purchase them, and we really wanted to use them as part of this project with Estella. To make the most of them, they hadn't been on display for many years, and lots of people really liked them. They remembered them from when they used to be on display. So this was a really nice way of us doing that.
And Estella, can we come to the point of the absence of people in these paintings? It was something that inspired you to kind of as a jumping off point for the works that you created.
Yeah, that's exactly right. When I first looked at these paintings with the former curator Sarah Corn, what struck me is they looked like empty theatre sets, and they were painted in quite a sort of, might I say, sort of generic way. They all look very, very similar. And so what interested me, with the help of my researcher Catherine Stimson, is going through and finding out the histories of each of the houses, but also of the land, because the land here now is in sort of contemporary times is suburban, but back then it would have been like looking at these houses, you could see that it was agricultural. So we went back and looked at an 1805 map, and that really gave us an idea of what was happening in the area, so around these big houses, and the people who were working class, who were labourers, who were middle class, that started to build a picture of their lives, their work, and the pastimes that they would have done. And one of those pastimes, looking at this 1805 map, there's a lot of activity of harvest and wheat production. So, you know, during that time, that's when things like straw work and corn dolly making, you know, would have happened during the harvest.
So this is what inspired you to think of the corn dolly project that was inspired by the painting. And we're going to talk a little bit more about corn dollies, but we first of all, I thought that we should probably describe how to make a corn doll, and that might help people to understand some of the process that went into the project, because as I understand it, kits were sent out to members of the community. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Amy? That they
so when we were designing this project, we didn't know that we were going to be in the middle of a pandemic, as nobody did. So the idea was that we were going to have Estella teach the art of corn dolly making and straw craft. It was really important to us that the community were involved with this project. So we put our thinking caps on in lockdown and decided that the best way of doing that was to send out kits. So we worked with Elaine Lindsay to create some corn dolly kits, which Estella very dutifully put together, and we sent them out to the community so that they could make them at home with a video and then send them back in. So they I know we're going to describe them a bit more later, but they came back to the museum, and it was a really lovely way of being able to involve the community in this endangered rural craft with Estella. Not quite in the way that we'd imagined, but it still was a really lovely and fruitful part of the project.
So let's move on to our next image, which is of a corn dolly. Now, corn dollies and straw work come in a variety of designs and are made from plaited straw, sometimes decorated with a ribbon. And I wanted to start by describing, as I mentioned, the Egham harvest tokens, which were used in this project. And they feature in Estella's sculptural piece, which we'll move on to next, which is called Thorpe Lammas. At the moment, we have this photograph, as I said, of the Egham harvest token on screen, which is tied with a brown ribbon. So on the Egham Visions website, which you might like to visit at your leisure after the talk, there's a lovely link to an online tutorial with the designer of this particular Egham harvest token, as Amy said, Elaine Lindsay, who's been a straw worker for 35 years. And she, believe me, she makes it look easy, but I know it's not. Each of these tokens, these particular ones, the Egham harvest tokens, requires 8 straws. And the finished tokens are about as large as the palm of my hand. They'd sit comfortably in the palm of my hand. Each individual straw has a head of wheat at one end and a plain stalk at the other. The straws are cut to the same length and have been dampened to make weaving easier and are then dried out later on in the process. Now, this particular corn dolly is made in 2 halves using 4 straws for each section. Then the 2 sections are fastened together. Each 4-straw bundle is tied just below the heads. The stalks are then splayed into a cross shape and then plaited. Now, because of the nature of the material, if you can imagine, the plaited sections are actually quite angular and spiky to touch, not the smooth plait you might feel in a piece of hair that was plaited. They're quite robust. The plait is then tied into a loop with the heads and stalks fanning out below, and the stalks are trimmed to the same length as the heads. Then the second loop is made in exactly the same way, threaded through the first, and then sort of massaged into a heart shape. Very pretty. The heart-shaped token with its lower fan of heads and stalks can then be decorated with a ribbon tied over the fastening. So as we said, Estella, the project encouraged people in the local community to create their own corn dollies. It's probably the first time anyone, had been asked to do this for quite a long time, apart from these straw workers like Elaine, who obviously is part of their practice. And what was the feedback? Did people find it difficult making these harvest tokens?
I think, some people, when they were handed in, they'd write in a little note saying mine's not very good, and they were fantastic.
Yeah.
They were completely, they were all really beautiful. And I think Elaine does these wonderful instructional videos that are really easy to follow. And so I think that really made it easier for people to accomplish at home. But what really amazed me is the variety of the embellishments that people have put on them. People, I thought people might just sort of tie, like this one, a brown ribbon, but a lot of people, they hot glue gunned rhinestones. They were colourful and gaudy, and put, on these tags, personal messages to people, that they cared for.
It was a really nice way of personalizing.
They would have been love tokens originally. That's the history of the token. They would have been made to somebody that they really cared about and then given with love. Have I got that right, Amy?
Yeah, so that was certainly part of the history of some types of harvest token. Due to the fact that they're made of straw, we've got few examples of some very early corn dollies, although I know Estella had a really lovely trip with Sarah, former curator, to the Museum of English Rural Life. They've got some extraordinary designs there in their stores. So Estella had a great time looking at those. But we were really keen, to work with Lindsay on this design and make it really personal, enable people to think about loved ones. These harvest tokens could have been made by straw workers and people working at harvest time, given to their loved ones, and things like that. So it was a really nice way of bringing that story, that piece of folklore, kind of into the museum's work with Estella for the exhibition. So it was a nice thing to be able to do, I think.
Yeah, and one of the surprising things is that when we originally wrote this, and obviously it was quite, near the beginning of the pandemic, we anticipated people would write things, sort of love notes to maybe someone they had a crush on, or their husband or their girlfriend or what have you. But what we received back were messages of loss of loved ones during the pandemic, of people that had supported them for the NHS. And I think that was really moving, part of the project.
I think so too.
So shall we move on to the piece that you actually use the Egham harvest tokens in, which we'll have a photograph on screen at the moment. So this is called Thorpe Lammer. So we'll ask Estella a little bit more about the title in a moment. It's, as we said, decorated with the Egham community tokens. It's placed in the center of the exhibition space and suggests a large haystack with a wooden maypole in its center. This work is based on a traditional haystack that would have been a familiar sight at harvest time. The wheat would have been raised off the ground using Stadle Stones to keep it away from mice. Similarly here, the base of the piece, a heavy wooden frame about 1.5 meters square, rests on 4 Stadle Stones, one placed under each corner of the frame. Now we're going to discuss the Stadle Stones in more detail with Amy shortly, as one of the 4 here is used here as an original Stadle Stone from the Egham Museum collection, and the other 3 are modern replicas made of concrete. Now let's describe the Stadle Stones a little. They're made of 2 sections, an angular trunk and a flat rounded top like a broad mushroom cap, and they reach to about knee height and they resemble stone fungi. The horizontal frame, which we mentioned, is bolted to the top of the 3 replicas, but merely rests on the original stone, so we don't damage it. And the stones protrude slightly from below the frame. They're not hidden in any way. The square wooden base is divided internally into 8 sections by wooden beams. These beams surround a central hole, like the spokes inside a wagon wheel, I thought, and fitted into the central hole and rising to a height of nearly 2.5 meters stands the thick wooden maypole. Packed into the base, spilling over the sides of the frame and then stacked up against the central maypole are multiple bundles of heritage wheat straw. Each bundle is about 50 centimeters tall for me to be able to encircle it with both my hands, even though my hands are quite small. So you get an idea of the shape of these bundles. Also attached to the frame at the base of each dividing beam are 8 lengths of plaited brown rope, which reach up and are tied to the top of the maypole, almost like guy ropes around a tent pole. Each of the ropes are decorated with evenly spaced Egham harvest tokens, and there are 7 tokens per rope. Each of the tokens, as we said, has been individually decorated and has a label attached with a handwritten message from the maker. Just to give you a little flavour, we talked slightly about some of the decoration, but there's such a wide range. I just wanted to describe 4 of them in more detail so you can get a flavour of the piece. One of the tokens is tied with an emerald green ribbon and decorated by a small brown bird figurine. The label is dedicated to Ken, and the message reads, "Thank you for believing in me and being such a support, such a gentleman and a wonderful father and grandfather." Another token is decorated with a circlet of small blue flowers and tied with a white ribbon. Written on the ribbon, the message, "Thank you, NHS and all key workers." Another is tied with a yellow ribbon, decorated with a fabric daffodil, and the message reads, "Token for the Marie Curie nurses. Thank you for all the good work you do." And finally, one tied with a red ribbon with the message, "To Roger, a constant companion for 46 years. Thanks for the memories." Now, as you said, that I found these really, really moving. I mean, it's just, there were some very moving messages, and then there were some other ones that were quite humorous. And I found it, as you said, it was just a sort of a collective moment that's come together here, Estella. Can you tell us a little bit more about the title of the piece?
Yeah,
Thorpe Lammer.
So it was named after one of the local field names that we found on the 1805 map, which was a pre-enclosure map of Egham. So instead of what you imagine now with farming, huge, enormous fields, these were very tiny little strip fields. And we found an area of activity near a spot called Englefield Green, where there were names like Harvest Corner, there was the Old Barleymow Pub, and Thorpe Lammas. And Lammas lands are named after an old practice of taking a hay cut on or before Lammas Day, which is the 1st of August, and then after that the cattle would be turned out to feed on the sort of leftover mown sort of wheat fields. So I thought that was a sort of suitable one to name, and I wanted to name the work after the local field names.
And Amy, it's time for our Stadle Stone chat, which I've been looking forward to. So we describe the Stadle Stones, but they're quite a different texture, aren't they, from the old one that we've got and the three replicas?
Yeah, so I can't stop talking about the Stadle Stones, and people think I'm very strange, but I'm very pleased.
No, I love them.
Allowed the time here to talk about them. So the one from the museum collection is from Thorpe, actually, from Manor Farm, and the original one, the one from the museum collection, is kind of worn, and you can run your hand over it, and it's much smoother, although it's kind of bobbly to the touch. And then the three that we had cast to support the rest of the haystack are much more coarse. You rub your hand over, and you can really feel the poured concrete of them.
Yeah, the old one is sort of blackened and patches of cream on it, and it's aged.
Yes.
Where the other three are sort of uniformly silver.
Yes,
but we love them all
at the top as well, which I quite enjoy.
Yeah, I just really love the thought of that little Stadle Stone sitting in a field somewhere all these years, and now suddenly being in this brightly lit space, wondering where it's landed. So we're going to move on now to Estella's second sculptural piece, and this is called Walking the Rainbow Field. And we're going to, at the moment, we've got a photograph of it on screen. It's a long shot, so it's a view from of the whole piece. So the second sculpture created by Stella is of a life-size heavy working horse. The work is titled Walking the Rainbow Field, as I mentioned. This impressive horse is about 2 meters high and nearly 3 from nose to tail. It has an internal frame of chicken wire and is covered in heritage straw, so it's a beautiful pale golden color. The horse is displayed side on to us and looks as if it's striding forward with its left front foot and its right rear foot lifted as it's moving, and its head raised proudly. And beneath horse's hooves, which is a nice touch, the grey carpet is strewn with brown earth. So we really get the sense of this horse in its environment, and using the materials that would have been locally grown to make it. Estella made hundreds of intricate Welsh fan corn dollies, which I will describe in a moment, to shape the head. The muscular striding horse body uses bundles of wheat stems sewn together using 2 styles of thatched roofing method, all traditional skills used at the time of Hassell's paintings. The different methods of handling and displaying the heritage straw and the effect this produces are cleverly used to differentiate the different parts of the horse. So its rough withers feel very different to its smoother plaited muzzle. Its fetlocks seem shaggy with rows of wheat overhanging its smoother rounded hooves. And its mane and tail are made of thick plaited raffia that stand proud of its wheaty pelt. We've got a close-up of the head of the horse, which reveals the intricacies of the maker. Its eyes, nose, and pointed ears are made of hundreds of woven wheat straw plaits using a pattern called Welsh fan. Now, the Welsh fan corn dolly is made using multiple straws, possibly up to 21. The shape starts off with just 3 tied together under the heads, and the straws are plaited with new straws being introduced and locked in at each turn. The shape of the final token has the plaited, almost feather-like central section with tightly woven stalks coming in on either side to form a V shape with a leaf-like vein down the centre. When the Welsh fan is independent, there are 2 legs of straw bundles at the bottom and a fan shape of heads at the top. But Estella has cut off the legs and the fan to use just the plaited, feathered central sections. And these are about a finger length with a rounded top and a pointed tail. These feather-like pieces are woven together in ingenious ways to form the texture of the head and to distinguish its features, such as flaring nostrils and eye sockets. Each eye socket, for instance, is contained within 2 sweeping horizontal feather shapes, the eye within indicated by closely feathered vertical stripes. And the pattern is really effective, I think, in creating the illusion of many individual hairs, creating the smooth fur of the horse. The texture on the body of the horse changes to broader sweeps of thatch, some raised and some flat. The wheat thrust in different directions to differentiate, say, neck from withers or back from rump. Estella, so much work has gone into this piece. Can you tell us a little bit more about the making of it?
So the horse piece, I was working on that full time for about 6 months, I think, with my assistant Mark Batty, who's working part time with me. It's sewn onto the frame underneath, the steel rebar, with then chicken wire layered over that. And each piece was made to size, and was sewn on one by one by one, and made one by one by one, because they are all carefully fitted together, and each side had to mirror image the sort of opposing side. And yeah, it was a labor of love, really. My hands were destroyed by the end of
you're
this
saying
project.
you kind of got, you know, corn dolly claw by the
Yeah, my hand
was about 500 individual Welsh fans for the
and I had to use wax bars at the end of the day to kind of get them moving again. And the technique, the thatching technique on the main part of the body, was actually a technique used to protect the top of haystacks from the elements during the year. So they would sew sheets of straw together. They actually used a machine, but I unfortunately did it by hand because those machines don't exist anymore. And they would have been wrapped around the top of a haystack. But I used those sheets and then wrapped those around the body of the sculpture. And with the shoulder and with the rump of the horse, I used the same, elements of straw roof thatching, and I sort of sewed together clumps of straw at the top, so they sort of would fall into piece, and then sewed those on individually. Yeah, so it were all traditional skills, but just used in a slightly innovative way.
And I think it's incredibly striking when you walk in, because it's so massive, and you just get the sense of this huge working horse, and then you suddenly realize the intricacies. I think it works really well to indicate all the different parts of the horse. Works beautifully. Amy, can we talk a little bit more about the title of the piece?
Yes.
What is the rainbow field?
So a rainbow field is, as you might imagine, the shape of a rainbow. So the way, as Estella described, these very small strips of land, sometimes depending on the terrain, they would have had these kind of curved shaped fields that would have been ploughed concentrically by the farmers. And we really enjoyed actually looking through the map and then going on to site. So we went over to what is now Runnymede, owned by the National Trust, and kind of piecing together these fields, because they often had names that were related either to the shape, in the case of this rainbow field, or the type of land. So our favourite was Tom Fool's Piece, or Tom Fool's Acre, which was, when we went, basically a pond. It was so wet that you couldn't possibly have used it for anything productive, so you would have been a fool to take it as your land. And we really enjoyed that process, actually, of using that 1805 map to really reconnect with the land and think about the way that those names have come down over time. So sometimes they've been lost, like Rainbow Field and things like that, but some of them have not. They've now become road names or building names and things like that. So we really enjoyed that process, and I'm really pleased that Estella decided to name this wonderful horse after the kind of that process and the fields that we found.
So we move on to a related object, which is displayed alongside the horse very appropriately in the exhibition. And I think we're going to take a look, and we're going to explore this wonderful lawn boot, which is on. There's a photograph of it on screen now, if it's useful for you to zoom in on it. So this is a leather lawn boot made by Hyde Saddlers of Egham. It's possibly late Victorian, and boots like this were used to protect people's lavish lawns, their fancy lawns, from the feet of working horses who might be tramping over them. This large round boot is 30 centimeters high, thick dark brown leather, and it's blackened and worn with age and use. The boot has been made large enough to fit over the shod hoof of a working horse. So this is a large round boot. It's got a thick base of about 20 centimeters, which is embedded with a copper wire, I think Amy and Estella discovered. And when you stroke the underneath of the boot, you can just feel it on the underside. The boot reaches up to just below the horse's forelock, with a room for the bulb of the heel and the front hoof or coronet. It has a V-shaped aperture at the front and is open at the back. The boot has two thick leather buckled straps, one at the bottom, which buckles at the back, and another that fastens around the horse ankle or pastern and buckles at the side. I've never before encountered an object like this, Amy. I didn't realize that horses had to wear shoes in certain circumstances. So, and I believe this single boot was the launch pad for a whole podcast that you guys put together, which is still out there on the internet.
Yeah, so Egham Museum has, or rather maybe had, a podcast called Egham Oddities, and that's really an opportunity for us to take some of the stranger items in our collection that maybe we don't know a huge amount about, or, as you said, Lonnie, I had no idea that as well as wearing shoes, horses also had to wear boots over their feet. So the Egham Oddities podcast was an opportunity to talk about that and Estella's work in more detail. Yeah, available online in all good podcast places, which you're very welcome to check out. But Egham Oddities is really an opportunity to think about our collection in a new way. It's very easy to discount an object like this because you maybe don't understand it, or you don't understand its relevance. But this one was made by Hyde Saddlers, who many people will recognise. The Hyde family had a leather shop on the high street for most of the 20th century, and people remember the smell of walking in and the experience of going into Hyde's leather shop. So that's what Egham Oddities is all about, and that's why we chose the lawn boot as part of that.
So we move from an object designed to protect a lavish lawn to an image of a property with only a large dirt yard in front. And this is our penultimate object. It's the second of our John Hassell watercolors. Again, it's in a white frame. But instead of being a large residence, a lavish residence, this one is a different kind of a dwelling altogether. It's called House of Industry and Poor House, and it was painted in 1822. The painting is the same size as our first painting, 20 centimeters by 15, and again painted in subtle tones of grey, pale brown, rust and sage. A workhouse or poor house were for those who couldn't be supported in their own homes or were without one altogether. And the term House of Industry came into favour in the late 18th century, usually denoting a non-residential workhouse, often specialising in the training and employment of children. As before, the central rectangular painting is framed by a white border, at the top of which the artist has written the place again in black cursive script, Egham, and Hassell has signed and dated the work in the lower right corner along with the title. As before, the dwelling takes up the lower half of the image, viewed from a distance across a dirt yard. The upper half of the picture is slate-coloured sky with patches of white cumulus cloud rising, puffing up from behind the houses. The building is formed of a row of higgledy-piggledy two-storey dwellings with some additions to create one property. The shabby buildings have a cottagey feel with pitched tiled roofs, a number of separate entrance doors and very small modest square windows. There are two sections in the centre that face onto us, one slightly taller with a gable window in the attic. The section on the far right is end on to us with a prominent chimney breast running up the wall, and the end section on the left is slightly narrower with a smaller, more primitive chimney. The buildings are painted pale pink, grey and brown, and there are small patches of sage green grass and low hedges, and with some sections of wooden fencing in front of the houses. But the yard in front is predominantly muddy, with lots of little patches of stones protruding. Amy, there's some records of the Egham Parish Vestry minute books, I think, has reference to one of these types of property.
Yes, so in December 1818, the Egham Parish Vestry minute books reference the proposed houses of industry to employ 100 poor children who would be spinning flax and wool in order to earn their keep, I suppose. And we found it really interesting looking at these. There's two paintings. There's this one, and there's a kind of similar one of the workhouse, which is more residential property. And we really enjoyed the contrast of looking at these, and then also thinking about the the large houses as the one that you described earlier. And I think it really describes the contrast in Egham at the time. The House of Industry was mentioned in the parish vestry minutes, and I think that's really interesting because the poor were the responsibility of the parish, of the church, to look after. So things like this were built, and it really shows the experience of kind of the more everyday people of Egham in the time post enclosure, especially when their ability to farm the land was restricted depending on the size of plot that they were given.
And Estella, again, we have no inhabitants here on your empty stage set.
Yeah, and I think where Catherine, my researcher, and I sort of discovered some of the voices of these people while we were researching these properties. And I went to the Surrey History Centre and I was looking through these vestry minutes, and you can see, so that we had the 1805 map, which is where you had common land, you had strip farming, and you had, you know, sort of labourers that may have lived on an estate, but then they would have had a few fields of their own to sort of subsistence farm. And post enclosure, which sort of happened slowly over the UK and in sort of fits and starts all over the UK. When you see later maps, when the Enclosure Act happens and these people lose their lands and lands get taken over by, you know, sort of esquires, lords, etc., ladies. And you then start seeing correlation to that in the vestry minutes, more and more poor, you know, sort of, and the people who are running the minutes are saying, you know, we can't keep up anymore, there's too many. And it goes from being, you know, sort of Widow Brown, who they know very well, and, you know, the son works hard and when he needs a new pair of shoes, to just sort of woman aged such and such. And it becomes very sort of distant and separate because there's just so many people. And yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah, we really enjoyed working with our researcher Catherine on that process, because as Estella said, we were so keen to kind of re-people these buildings, and those minutes were a tiny glimpse into being able to do that. And we thought it was really interesting the way that you can build these whole stories out of a jumping off point like this, which is so devoid of any human interaction at all, to have these kind of conversations recorded in minutes and things like that, even though the stories are obviously often quite sad. The idea that these people had some sort of voice as a legacy, I think, is really important to talk about.
So it brings us to our final object, really, which is also concerned with connecting to the inhabitants who peopled spaces such as the cottages, which we've just been describing. And our final objects are a pair of white clay pipes. They're displayed on a blue velvet base inside the glass display table that we mentioned at the beginning of our event. Also on display with the pipes are a number of other pipes and a collection of silver pocket watches, which belong to more affluent members of Egham's community. But these pipes were cheaply produced at the time and were for everyday smoking and for everyday people. We're thinking again of who might have inhabited that dirt yard. The two pipes we've chosen to describe are an original pipe from the museum collection and a new replica pipe made by the pipe artist O.J. Meeson. And Meeson specializes in making traditional 19th century tobacco clay pipes using original molds and original techniques. Both pipes displayed here, we have a photograph on screen, are made of white earthenware clay fired in a kiln. And they're both examples of the popular thorn design. These represented a briar pipe where the rose plant's prickles are shown on the stem of the pipe and the bowl. The original pipe, which is a little shorter than the replica, has browned with age. The base of the bowl has no heel, so the user would not have been able to rest it on a surface without it potentially tipping over and spilling his tobacco. The spikes decorating the bowl and the stem close to the bowl are a little rounded and smoother to the touch than the prickles on the replica, which are quite sharp. Meeson's replica, displayed below the original pipe, is crisp, fresh, and a fresh white colour. The bowl of Meeson's pipe is slightly more elongated and angled away from the stem, and there is a heel under the bowl, so the pipe would have been able to be put down and stand up on its own. The prickles on the new pipe are bolder, as we said, and less worn, and would feel much more like thorns, replicating to the touch the feel of the briar rose. Two lovely light items, Amy. I love them. But the old one has that lovely worn patina of something that was, I'm assuming, excavated in the area.
Yeah, so these pipes are alongside a number of others that came to us at a time when, as I mentioned, when the museum was founded in the 60s and throughout the early 70s and into the 80s, actually, having said that, there was lots of work going on locally. The town was changing a lot, lots of development work was going on. So a lot of people felt a need to go in there first to see what they could find. And for that reason, we are really lucky to have a large number of pipes in lots of different designs, and we found out about them through this project. But they kind of came from the earth as well. So we're talking about all of this land and the way that the land was used, but albeit 150 years after the Hassell paintings, these clay pipes were dug up by volunteers who really cared about the place and felt that it was important, as we do, to record history and preserve it in the form of these objects that we now look after at Egham Museum. So it was a really nice way of, again, bringing in the museum collection and then putting them with Ollie's pipes to really show that they were once bright and vibrant, and they weren't always as kind of dirty looking as they were once they'd been in the ground 100 years or so. So yeah, another way of bringing in those kind of endangered crafts and modern makers like Stella and the others that have been involved with this project.
Well, that brings us to the end, but I'm sure people would like to ask Estella. So we're just going to be opening the floor again. So if you would like to, have we enabled the chat function again?
Yeah, I should have just been able to, yeah.
So if you have a question for Amy or Estella, do please fill it in. And we'll take some questions from everyone who's joined us this afternoon.
Oh, let me make that bigger. That's a very lovely long question. So a question from Peter for Estella, which says, I've become a bit obsessed with the idea of enclosures at the moment since reading Sylvia Frederiki's Caliban and the Witch, where she describes the correlation between enclosures and witch burning. You talk about the way that the poor became anonymised post-enclosure. I wonder if you perceived any dialogue between the destruction of the community and your experiences with suburban Egham engaging with your work.
I'll break that up into two bits. The bit about the poor. I haven't read that book, actually. Now I'm going to
add it to your list.
Add it to my list. And I think the way the poor become anonymized is, I mean, there was a lot of things obviously going on at that time because it was around the time of industrialization. And so, I mean, the sort of explosion of the poor at that time, there were other factors to that as well. It wasn't just the wars going on, all sorts of other things. But specifically with enclosures and their impact, you can definitely see the volume of the poor requesting help and assistance, and that going from being very personal to being very impersonal, and to the point where they actually say, as a community, we can't, this needs to be state assistance now, we cannot cope. And the reason why they couldn't cope anymore is because all these people were becoming displaced. They were going out on the road, and you know, people often at that time, working class people often they'd never leave their own village, but they were leaving to go to other villages because they were desperate and they couldn't. And you see that in the sort of pastoral care notes, where they're saying, well, we can only help our own, we can't help people, you know, who are coming into the town, like they need to prove that they're from here. And the second point, I wonder if you perceived any dialogue between that district.
I think that sorry to interrupt, Estella, I think that kind of brings in that idea that as Egham was changing in the 60s and 70s and 80s, 1960s, it's not dissimilar. The changes that were going on kind of post-enclosure for people in Egham, people don't generally respond necessarily that well to change in their landscape. And I think although the change was really different in the 60s compared to in the early 1800s, I think that's kind of what we've talked about a lot, is the relationship with people and place. you can make those parallels, definitely. Thank you, Peter. Unless you have anything else. Thank you, Peter, for that question. From Catherine, thank you. Where is the horse going next?
That's a good question.
Great question, Catherine. Thank you. So we would have loved to turned this exhibition into a touring one, and that may still happen. We're hoping that in the next year you will be able to see Estella's Walking the Rainbow Field elsewhere in other museums. It's still to be confirmed, but that's the plan.
Yeah,
so far. From Lisa, what's next for your work, Estella?
Well, when I started this project, I had no idea. I had assumed that I was going to commission other straw work artists to actually help me create the work. I didn't realize that it would be me on my own doing it, and that I would become proficient, you know, sort of as a beginner in it. But I have become really interested in the craft, quite passionate about ensuring, because it's endangered, ensuring its survival. So I won a KEST, Queen Elizabeth Trust Scholarship, to learn with Elaine, who you know, was one of our partners on the project, and also Veronica Main. So I've been learning under them, and I'll be learning under them until sort of the end of December. And from there, I will keep working, you know, I'll keep making video work and installation work, but I would like to continue with straw work too.
We're certainly really pleased that Stella's continuing it. It's been really nice to see her kind of learn this craft over time with Elaine, and I can't wait to see what she does next. And that kind of brings us to the end, really. Unless anyone has any other burning questions, we've just made it to 5:25. So I just wanted to say thank you to Estella for joining us, and to Lonnie too. This is the first time we've done an audio described event like this. I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to Lonnie's descriptions and hearing Estella talk about the work, so I hope you all have too. If you want to come and check out the exhibition, little plug, it's open until the 18th of December at the museum. We're open on a Tuesday and a Thursday and a Saturday morning, but there's more information available on the website, and there's also the Visions website to enjoy as well. There's lots of resources on there for you to have an explore of, really. We put lots of Catherine Stimson's research work onto there because we didn't want it all to go to waste, so a large amount of the rest of the work is available on there should you wish to check it out. So yes, thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you soon.